Hello, everyone. Welcome to CAPS 2022 and this breakout session entitled Reducing Suicide Stigma on Christian College Campuses. My name is Curtis Lehmann, and I'm an associate professor at Azusa Pacific University. I'd like to introduce my co-presenters. First off, we have Alyssa Marten, who is a graduate student in the Master's in Research Psychology and Data Analysis program at APU. And is completing her thesis with me. And also Dr. Nathaniel Fernandez, who is who works at the University Counseling Center as the outreach coordinator. Okay, so glad to have you. Thanks for attending. For this seminar, we actually have 4 learning objectives that we're going to be covering. The first one is that you, at the end of this, you'll be able to identify specific mechanisms in how suicide stigma operates as a barrier to suicide prevention. Secondly, you will be able to identify 4 Christian theological concepts that contribute to the stigma of suicide. Third, you will know how to implement an evidence-based intervention for reducing suicide stigma among college students into a learning management system. I'll briefly talk about that. And lastly, you will know how to address Christian theology of suicide in clinical work to support those recovering from suicidal ideation or attempt. So for that last point, we want this to be hopefully more generalizable to clinicians in various settings, not just those working with Christian college students. To start, I want to really underscore that in order to support students' overall general mental health, it's critical that we address suicide. Suicidal thoughts and behaviors are prevalent among college students. One cross-national study found that 17.2% had thought about suicide in the past year, and about a third had thought about it in their lifetime. In regards to making plans for suicide, 8.8% of college students had made plans to end their life in the past year, and 17.5% in their lifetime. And finally, for suicide attempt, the study found that 1% had attempted suicide in the past year, and 4.3% had attempted in their lifetime. So clearly, the numbers show that this is a prevalent problem. So in order to address suicide properly, of course, we should be targeting risk factors, mental health conditions, campus climate, but it is also important to address stigma. And that's particularly important with young adults. They have been noted to be critical for efforts at reducing stigma around suicide. And interventions can reduce 2 major types of stigma. The first type is the public stigma. This is the general attitudes of those who do not have suicide problems with suicidality, and basically their attitudes towards people who do have concerns related to suicidality. And the second type of stigma is personal stigma. Personal stigma is the attitudes and actions of those experiencing suicidality related to their own experiences. So I'm going to walk you through that in a little bit more detail, but let me just highlight that lessening stigma could potentially impact general college students and help them to be better at providing support for those people that are experiencing suicidality, or it could help people who are experiencing suicidality lessen the stigma that they feel towards themselves. Okay, so let me unpack each of these 2 types of stigma. So the first one, the public stigma of suicide. And that can impact suicide prevention in several ways. So we know that stigma can lead to avoidance of those who attempt suicide. When people hold stigmatizing views towards those who are experiencing suicidality, one of the primary reactions is to simply avoid or not talk to those people and limit your social contact. Sometimes it's called social distancing. And unfortunately, this avoidance can interfere with suicide gatekeeping. We know it's critical to have gatekeepers who are prepared to ask questions, um, persuade people towards getting services, and refer them to appropriate treatment. And if they're avoiding them, obviously they're not going to be able to function as a quality gatekeeper. In fact, sometimes the stigma is so severe that even saying the word suicide can be difficult for some. So public stigma can directly impact through the avoidance. It can also impact those experiencing suicidality directly by communication of stigmatizing attitudes. So the way people talk about suicidal issues could directly impact people who are experiencing suicidality if it's, if it conveys prejudice or discrimination. And so clearly that can be an important part of addressing stigma and suicide on campus. But I also want to highlight personal stigma, because those who are experiencing suicidality often stigmatize themselves. Sometimes this is called self-stigma. And personal stigma can also impact suicide prevention efforts. The research shows that stigma, again, personal stigma, can be a barrier to disclosure of past or current suicidal thoughts or behaviors. So even if the community around a person doesn't hold stigmatizing views, if the person stigmatizes their own thoughts or behaviors, that can keep them from ever disclosing it in the first place. Similarly, if those who want to seek out treatment, so disclosure is for peers and non-professionals, but we also know that it's a hindrance to seeking out professional services, the stigma. Finally, if you believe you must keep your suicidal history a secret, that's actually related to greater risk of suicide attempt among suicide attempt survivors. So this is across the board showing that this stigma can hinder the suicide prevention efforts. And so, again, I just want to underscore that if we address this, it could potentially strengthen our suicide prevention efforts. But the lens that we are primarily focused on is actually related to religious stigma towards suicide. So again, stigma towards suicide, it's a complex phenomenon, and it actually is composed of stereotypes, like beliefs about people who think about suicide or engage in suicidal behavior, prejudices or emotional reactions, and then discrimination or behaviors related to suicide and how do people react. And of course, that stigma is influenced considerably by religious beliefs and practices. And that's what shapes how people, what people believe about those who experience suicide and those who engage in suicidal actions. So interventions, if we're trying to address stigma, I want to make the case that we also need to address problematic religious beliefs that are contributing to stigma, and perhaps even promote helpful religious beliefs that could support comprehensive efforts at suicide prevention. So we want to reduce certain problematic beliefs that are present within religion, but also promote the positive resources that the religious beliefs and religious values can provide. Now, our interest is actually going to focus not just in religion in general, but Christian college students. So what beliefs should be addressed with Christian college students? And so we think that there's 4 major concepts. Now, I don't think this list is exhaustive, but we believe that there are 4 concepts in particular that are prevalent and that they contribute a lot to the stigma of suicide. So I'm going to walk you through these 4, but in the slides that follow, I'm going to actually unpack that a little bit more for you. So let me just list them here. The first one is believing that faith guarantees relief from mental health problems. So we think that contributes to stigma towards suicide. Secondly, believing that all who die by suicide go to hell. We think that's a problematic belief and that it contributes to stigma. Third is viewing suicide as a mortal sin. Now, I'll unpack, this is more of a theological idea, but I'll unpack this later. And then fourth, viewing suicide as a willful choice. And it seems as if that even Christians who don't fully agree with these beliefs can actually get stuck on them because they just exist in our culture, and they're actually quite hard to break these beliefs. And so oftentimes people sort of default to these beliefs. So we're going to talk about an approach where we are trying to reduce all four of these beliefs and ways of thinking about suicide. And we're going to depict a contrary position to each of these beliefs and integrate some scriptural positions and psychological concepts to make the point. So we actually have developed an intervention to decrease stigma among Christian college students. Educating on the limits of these problematic beliefs that I just showed you, those four problematic beliefs, we believe it can help lessen the stigma of suicide. Now, rather than just didactically educating people around these issues, we thought it might be better to use a more engaging approach. And Rao et al. In 2015 suggested the use of a photonovela to decrease stigma towards suicide. And that's the approach that we ended up using. So we took that advice, and a photonovela, if you're not familiar with it, is a story that uses images and text boxes. So kind of think of a comic book, and I'll show you some images that from our photonovela, and it's kind of like a comic book with text boxes to describe a conversation that is occurring in a story-like fashion. So although the term is Spanish, this is not just appropriate for Spanish-speaking college students. This is it's just a generally helpful means of conveying information in an engaging manner across cultural context. And so my thought was, college students get enough lectures. It'd be great for them to learn some of this material in a story fashion. And so that's our approach. So let me explain this photonovela, because I know it's a kind of hard to wrap your head around. We created a photonovela depicting a conversation between a male college student who was experiencing suicidal thoughts and his male pastor. And so we developed a script for this photonovela that was intended to provide clear and engaging communication of some of the Christian theological concepts in a casual language. So we wanted it to feel like a conversation that ended up being a little bit educational, but still felt like it was just a story, a conversation occurring between a student and his pastor. And so we took photos, and I'd like to thank our two photographers and our two models for this project. Without this, their voluntary help, we wouldn't be able to have done this project. And so cultural representation was an important consideration. And so we had an African-American male in the role of the pastor, and he actually was a pastor, and a Latino male who played the college student. So let me show you what this actually looks like, because just trying to describe it doesn't really, it's kind of hard to gather what this looks like. But this is one of the slides from the photonovela. And you can see there's two panels, the top panel and the bottom panel. And you have the pastor on the right and the student on the left. And the pastor says, "I'm glad to hear you're feeling better and are taking steps to get help." So some background, In the previous slide, it shares that this student has started seeing a therapist and is benefiting from working with a therapist, but he really wants to get some spiritual insight into his suicidal thoughts. So the pastor asks, so how can I help you today? And the student responds, I've still been wrestling with some questions. To be honest, I'm kind of embarrassed to even be asking about them, but I trust you'll be real with me. And so you could see this is just a conversation. It was intended to be very pastoral. And the student is really gets the conversation going because he says, yeah, I've been wondering if thinking of suicide means I don't really trust God or that I don't have as strong of a relationship with him as I thought. So you can see this is an early slide and it sets the tone. What does suicide mean for my faith? And so the rest of the photo novella, it's really trying to unpack that and have the student present concerns, ways that he's thought about suicide that reflect these four main ideas that we talked about previously. And the pastor is kind of rebuffing them and presenting a different way of thinking about it. So let me, again, walk through the four concepts that we're addressing. So the first one was suicide as weak faith. I can also call this, and I like the term, the emotional prosperity gospel. So one major concept that we address is the idea that suicidality is a sign of weak faith. And again, that's been termed the emotional prosperity gospel. So individuals with mental illness, including those with suicidality, are often, or at least sometimes, perceived by some Christians as capable of controlling their mental health with faith. So if they just had more faith, they would have good mental health. Now, from this perspective, mental health is an indicator of a good spiritual life, and symptoms of mental illness can be seen as proof of a lack of faith. So here you have a slide that addresses it. We have several slides that address this, but this was one poignant one. So the student asks, but what's wrong with that? Doesn't faith bring joy and hope? So they're talking about this belief. Okay, is it something that faith can relieve your mental health problems and relieve your thoughts of suicide? And the pastor wants to affirm that faith is good for mental health. Faith is a source of both of those things. Faith can give you purpose, help you reframe challenges, connect you to a community of support, and allow you to feel close to God. Faith typically brings about joy and hope. But there's a big difference between the pattern and a guarantee. God doesn't promise us that we will only experience joy and hope during our earthly life. Sure, we will all experience perfect joy in God's presence, but John 16:33 teaches that in this life, you will have troubles. So simply having faith isn't enough. And again, the pastor doesn't want to minimize faith, but he wants to really emphasize that faith is helpful, but it doesn't guarantee. So he responds, well, there are plenty of passages that are designed to encourage us during difficult times. We wouldn't need that encouragement if faith guaranteed emotional health. Yeah, that's a good point. So you could see there's this conversation occurring, and it's setting the tone that these beliefs that the student holds are not entirely true. There's a little bit of nuance to it. Okay, now the second belief is all who die by suicide are condemned to hell. So we know that some Christians believe that those who die by suicide will be eternally condemned to hell. I can't get into all the history in this section, but the belief is generally rooted in the idea that suicide is blasphemy or an act against God's sovereignty, even though there's no scripture that indicates this to be the case. So let me show you how we address that. So the student says, but I still just wonder, what would have happened to my soul? Doesn't the Bible teach that people who do kill themselves go to hell? And the pastor responds, actually, there's nothing in the Bible that teaches that a person goes to hell for dying by suicide. And the student is surprised, really? And the pastor responds, yep, when the Bible records the deaths of people who die by suicide, like King Saul, Samson, and others, There's no moral condemnation or suggestion they were condemned to hell. But the pastor really wants to be careful not to dismiss it as not being a problem whatsoever. He says, but we should be careful not to glorify suicide. The Bible makes clear in how the stories were told that these suicides were tragedy. So he wants to emphasize that they're tragedies, but not tragedies that lead to condemnation to hell. All right. The third idea that we addressed was the idea that suicide is a mortal sin. Now, the concept of mortal sin, I will give you a little bit of history here. It's been present in the Catholic Church since the 3rd century, although it's not accepted in most Protestant denominations or within Orthodox Christianity. Nevertheless, we thought it would be important to address it. So a mortal sin has been defined as a sin whose object, and this is from the Catholic Catechism, a sin whose object is grave matter, which is also committed with full knowledge and deliberate consent. And so suicide was previously characterized as a mortal sin by the Catholic Church. However, the Catholic Church in about 1983 removed suicide from its list of mortal sins and now holds that in order for sin to be mortal, the individual must be mentally competent. And so now the Catholic position really is not that suicide is a mortal sin. However, of course, this belief lingers. So we have the pastor actually engages it. The pastor acknowledges that he doesn't come from a position that believes in mortal sin, but he's familiar with the concepts, and so he talks about it. And he integrates a psychological idea to address this. So he says, suicide is not about getting to the other side. It's about escaping this side. For me, that means the person isn't freely consenting to suicide. They are doing so under duress. The individual is not under a clear state of mind. They're thinking through the lens of their crisis state. And the student responds, that's a good point. How can a person make a free and deliberate choice when they're literally feeling tormented? I can definitely attest to the pain I felt when I was thinking of suicide. It was awful. So you can see here that they're addressing one of the elements of the requirements for a mortal sin, and that is deliberate consent. And so the pastor is saying the person who is suicidal or who engages in suicidal behavior isn't consenting to that behavior. They are mentally tormented. They're trying to escape their mental distress. And for that reason, the pastor says, I don't think it would meet the criteria for a mortal sin. Again, we're not sure if the people reading this will be persuaded, but we wanted to offer it up as a different way of thinking about it. And so then finally, the fourth idea is suicide is a willful decision or an individual sin. So the photonovella also challenged the notion that suicide is a decision of the will. Now, many Christians uphold this position. And I don't want to, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Conference has a statement that's related to this. The ERLC, they actually distinguish between volitional suicides and suicides due to biological or psychological causes. So they're not completely on the side that portrays it only as a willful decision, but they do have a typology that suggests that sometimes it's done volitionally or willfully. And we know that many Christians, or I suspect many Christians, hold the idea that it's just a willful decision that people decide to end their life. And the problem, in my estimation, is that it minimizes or overlooks the role of biology, circumstances, and sociocultural factors in suicide. Or in other words, it overlooks systemic sin and frames it only as an individual sin. So the photonovella challenges that idea, and the pastor says, every part of creation has been stained by sin. Our biology is broken, Our ways of thinking are distorted. Our ways of relating with other people are broken. So it seems sensible to treat the problem in all these ways. So the pastor is conceptualizing it as a systemic issue, biological, psychological, and relational, and saying that we need to treat all these issues if we want to have a comprehensive response to suicide. So it respects the influence of sin in this view, but emphasizes a more systemic understanding of sin. And again, that has implications for treatment. A systemic view allows for medication and therapy rather than only spiritual efforts to change, which I won't show you, but is one of the themes that gets discussed in this photonovella. Now, everything that I've covered so far has been kind of theoretical. There's plenty of resources that some of them are cited, but some of them are not cited in terms of where we got these ideas. But we really wanted to not just say, oh yeah, we think this is going to be helpful, so we want to, roll this out across Christian campuses. Instead, we wanted data. So from the onset, we designed this study so that it could be evaluated for effectiveness in decreasing stigma. And we utilized a pre-post randomized design that was delivered entirely online. So we disseminated this photonovella entirely online, and we actually, in our research study, linked participants from SONA to a Canvas self-study page. And they were either went to the experimental condition, which was a photonovella, or a control condition, which was the gatekeeper training. The goal being was to investigate whether the data supported the effectiveness of the photonovella in reducing public stigma of suicide. Now, I'd like to briefly cover the results of that study. And so I'm going to turn it over to my graduate student, Alyssa, who's going to explain what we found, explain our study and what we found in terms of the effectiveness of this photonovella.
Yes. So what is really unique, as Dr. Lehmann said, is that we are not only presenting the idea of the photonovella, but we are able to present the effectiveness of it. So once again, we did this by collecting data on participants. The participants were given a URL link. However, unknown to them, the link was randomizing them to one of two Canvas pages. Now, these Canvas pages were completely identical. They had the same text, the same images, the same set of modules. However, the only difference is that one of the Canvas pages was the control group and had the gatekeeper training, while the other experimental group or Canvas page had the photonovella training. So with this, we were able to create a double-blind design. So although this was a good method, we did have a shortcoming that the design was comparing the photonovella to an active intervention opposed to using a true control, which would be would have no expected effects or outcomes. We chose to go with the gatekeeper training, however, because this is currently the most standardized intervention used amongst college students, and so we decided it would be a good intervention to compare the photonovella to. So the participants of this study, we had 255 undergraduate students, and these students were in lower division psychology courses at a faith-based university. Two aspects of these participants were that they were ethnically diverse and they made up of different religious preferences. Specifically for ethnic diversity, that was very important for us. We wanted to know that varying ethnicities were able to receive the photonovella well, resonate with it well, and still have similar outcomes across varying ethnicities. Additionally, APU does not require a faith statement in order to be a undergraduate or graduate student. So we did have a good diversity of Christian backgrounds. We had 34.1% non-denominational, 25.5% Catholic, 24.7 Protestant, 5.9, and so on were of different religious preferences that also made up. But primarily, we did have a strength in having different Christian traditions in which we were sensitive with for the photonovella. Next, we have our measures. So the participants completed 8 measures, both prior, pre, and post test. And this was given after the exposure or the intervention. The 8 measures were the gatekeeper behavior scale, stereotypes of suicide scale, 3, glorification, 4, the religious beliefs about suicide consequences, 5, prognosis optimism, 6, prejudice, 7, avoidance, and 8, disdain. And once again, these measures were given to them prior to interacting with either the gatekeeper or the photonovella training. And then once again, we measured them post-test after they took the intervention. Our primary outcome measures was the change in these scores from pre to post-test. So here's the results we have just on the photonovella training itself. We ran a paired sample t-test, which found significant differences in 7 of the 8 measures, which is pretty significant. We were very happy with those results. Some of those differences were increases in scores, while some were decreases in scores, which is important to know that we are wanting some of those measures to increase. For example, gatekeeper behaviors, we would want students or participants having higher scores and knowing how to respond to suicide behaviorally. However, for stigma scores, we would want those to decrease. We want to see a lessening of scores for them to see them, just having better perspectives of suicide from decreasing any negative myths or stigmatizing beliefs. So the ones that we saw an increase in, significant increase, were gatekeeper behavior and prognosis optimism. And to the right, you can look at the chart that goes through each of them. If you want to explore those farther, you can pause the video here. Now, gatekeeper behavior would be something regarding maybe recognizing when someone is in distress. And if those scores increase, that would be great if they knew how to. And so the photonovella was able to do that successfully. Now we have prognosis optimisms. Those scores also increased. And this would be participants knowing or believing that a person can recover after attempted suicide or having suicide ideation, which is also good. We want participants to have a better view and optimism of a individual's hope with suicide. Next, we saw a decrease in about 5 of the measures. So the first one is stereotypes of suicide. So we saw a decrease in those stereotypes. A stereotype towards suicide might be someone with suicide is cowardly or immoral or ungrateful for life. Those are some stereotypes that we'd want to see a decrease. The photonovella was also successful in decreasing religious beliefs about suicide consequences. As Dr. Lehmann mentioned, we would want people to not have any negative beliefs, religious beliefs about suicide. So we did see that the photonovella was able to decrease an individual from believing that suicide was an immoral act or that the suicide individual was condemned to hell, which is great. Lastly, we have prejudice, avoidance, and disdain. We saw a decrease in all 3 of those scores. Some examples of those would be prejudice. Maybe someone would feel scared being around someone with suicide. Avoid would be, I would avoid dating someone who struggles with suicidal ideation. And lastly, disdain, that would look like I would be cautious around someone who has attempted suicide. Now, what is most significant and really neat is that those 5 measures there that decreased, the 5 of those together really encapsulate that larger public stigma and even self-stigma that Dr. Lehmann was talking about earlier, which is really a key aspect in suicide prevention. And to see that the photonovella itself was able to decrease all those 5 measures shows that this would be a really effective training to do stigma intervention for suicide and know that it's effective in reducing stigma as a whole, which is really great. Next slide. So from there, we went ahead and did some analysis and compared the photonovella to the gatekeeper training. We wanted to see in what ways the photonovella was more effective and in what ways was the gatekeeper more effective. So for the photonovella, first we had the photonovella was significantly better in decreasing stereotypes towards suicide than the gatekeeper training, which is what we expected. The photonovella teaches more about those attitudes and beliefs, while the gatekeeper training teaches more on the behavioral mechanisms, how to respond to suicide. Second, for the photonovella, it was better at decreasing, once again, the beliefs about suicide or religious stigma, which once again, the photonovella was able to address those religious beliefs straight on. Next, the gatekeeper had its strengths as well. It was better, significantly better than the photonovella in teaching the gatekeeper skills, as we mentioned, which is expected. That is what it is designed to do. Lastly, and second, the gatekeeper training was significantly better at increasing the prognostic optimism scores than the photonovella. Now, although the gatekeeper training was able to do both of those things better than the photonovella, it's important to know that the photonovella was still significantly capable and effective in also increasing those gatekeeper skills and increasing those prognostic optimisms. The gatekeeper training was just able to do it slightly better or more statistically. Next. So from there, we just have three key takeaways from this research and this data. The first is that the photonovella is a very useful model. It is extremely adaptable, replicable, and it's very creative way to communicate a message. I really believe any of you listening to this presentation could take this training and replicate it on your own university or your own counseling clinic. It is a very adaptable to any setting. And it's also just a fun way, as Dr. Lehmann said, to have an intervention that is showing real people in a real moment, having dialogue that feels very authentic, I think is a really great way to communicate such a strong message. Second, we have the idea that it's a possibility that we could combine the photonovella and the gatekeeper training together. We know that the photonovella training had strengths, and we also know that the gatekeeper training had strengths. And so it's exciting to think what would the potential or possibilities be if we incorporated both of those trainings together, and what type of success would we see if we were able to create that and have that for suicide prevention. Lastly is just the uniqueness of this photonovella being completely an online intervention. Dr. Lehmann and I were able to complete this study for the past year amidst COVID complications, and we were still able to gather a large enough sample size. We were still able to do it effectively. And so just to know that even amidst COVID and any future complications, that the online intervention is accessible anywhere at any time without a trainer, and someone could really take it right in their home, which would allow it to be accessible to a lot more people, which is just really unique compared to an in-person training. Yeah, and so those are the three key takeaways. I hope that you can think about those further, and I'm happy to present those statistics with you. From here, I'm going to pass things on to Nathaniel, and he's going to be looking at clinical applications of this.
All right. Thank you, Elisa. I really appreciate it. So again, just to re-identify myself, my role at APU is as the outreach coordinator for our university counseling center. So this project has been a huge blessing to be a part of, because one of the main things I do is manage our gatekeeper trainings, right? And so I just want to identify my position going into this as we start to talk about the applications to clinical work that we might see out of something like this. And the first thing that I want to start with is just this idea of sort of self-selection. This is something that we see a lot. We have a somewhat captive audience with our residential students, right? And so we're able to see, the differentiation in the number of folks that are struggling with suicidal ideation or suicidal behaviors that self-present to our office, and those that do not, right? They're either identified by someone who has undergone one of the gatekeeper trainings, or they're unfortunately an emergency situation comes up, and that's how they're identified as struggling with some of these thoughts, right? And so it really underlines the fact that our clinical populations are self-selected, and they're usually self-selected for lower suicide stigma, right? Lower personal stigma, because otherwise they'd be less likely to present, right? It's a factor in service seeking, and we know that. And so one of the great things about this intervention, and one of the things that I would encourage those of you that are working in any sort of community-based program, university-based program, anything where you have access to a larger population rather than just the individual clientele that come in, uh, the first thing to do when working with theology of suicide and within clinical work is targeting some of these interventions outward, right? Targeting some of these interventions so that they're addressing a whole population. That way we can hopefully address, public stigma, as well as for the people that interact with that, addressing their own personal stigma as well. And so I think that this is critical. And then I just wanted to piggyback on something Alyssa said as well. Um, two, 20% of our gatekeeper training this year so far, we've done a little over 1,000. 20% of it's been in person. The rest of it's all been online, and it's only going to continue to go in that direction. And so I think that it can't be overstated enough what Alyssa said about the usefulness of this photo novella in those kind of scalable online environments. But if you don't mind passing to the next slide, let's get into what we would actually do in the clinical room. So this is going to be drawing on a lot of my clinical experience as well, and any examples I share, I'll of course alter to protect confidentiality. But I think it's important for us to consider stigma, these stigmatized beliefs, these emotional beliefs, these as almost implicit theologies, right? This is something that Curtis alluded to previously, right? For instance, in some cases, like the Catholic doctrine has changed around mortal sin and suicide, but that's not necessarily something that translates into the average population necessarily, right? We know that there's a persistence of false beliefs, if you want to think about it that way, right? And so I find it really useful to dive back into the concept of God image versus God concept that some of you may be familiar with already. But the idea is that we have both of these within us. And our God image is that implicit relational knowing that we have about theology and about God and about his relationship to us, right? Um, and this is may be congruent or may be incongruent with our God concept, which is sort of our head knowledge of the divine attachment figure. This is sort of the theology as we learn and study it, or as it's preached on Sundays. Sometimes we are in a theologically minded congregation, right? And so if we take that kind of idea, then we can start to see the effects of all this religious stigma towards suicidal persons and suicidal behaviors as a piece of that implicit God image, right? Because that's where these emotional thoughts hang out, especially when, as you saw in the photo novella, there's a lot of good arguments to break down some of these stigmas, a lot of good biblical arguments that might fit into a God concept, but don't necessarily fit into that God image. So the biggest advice that I would have, for you is to really engage with these stigmatized beliefs, or some of these four beliefs that Curtis and Alyssa have outlined, or other stigmatizing beliefs, the same way that you would treat any other unfounded belief, right? And that could be different as you approach from different theoretical lenses, right? But especially within a CBT lens, like we could consider these almost irrational beliefs that we have a lot of tools in order to counter. Um, uh, for instance, uh, we might go ahead and directly challenge beliefs, and sort of like the way that the photo novella is doing. Asking does that, whatever the stigmatized belief is, fit with what you know about God, right? And I found that this one is actually quite interesting to use with clients. For instance, I had been working with a client recently who identifies as Catholic, and in that space, was deeply into Catholic theology as a major part of her identity, right? And even saying to that client, like, okay, does that fit with doctrine, right? And she was very easily able to say, no, that doesn't fit with doctrine, because usually people who experience the most religious stigma are going to have some of the higher religiosity in general. It's going to be more related to knowledge of some of these concepts. So she was very easily able to say, no, no, it's not, because that's not how it's defined by the church, right? And so then we started to be able to wrestle with that dissonance, right? And we started to be able to heal some of that God image stuff. But I think another one that it always is helpful, especially for those that may not be so theologically savvy or so logical about their belief systems. I think going ahead and doing the "what would you say to a friend" intervention that we probably use a lot of the time, evoking that empathy is can be really important, right? Because there's going to be a lot less likelihood that someone would take a directly harsh, stigmatizing stance um, towards a good friend or relation than they would towards themselves, for example, right? So if they're the person that's experiencing the suicidal ideation or has experience with suicidal behaviors, um, evoking that empathy is going to really, really help. And then finally, um, promoting flexibility, I think, could be a really good one too. And I've noticed this one is especially useful for folks um, whose theology maybe does explicitly view suicide as sinful, right? Or does it explicitly believe in damnation to hell, or any of these types of phrases, right? Um, because it's very easy to get into a theological debate within a counseling session. And it's very easy not to go anywhere doing that, right? Because we'll also find ourselves aligning against the religious figures in the student's life or in the client's life. And that's not going to lead us anywhere other than lead our clients away from us, right? And so instead of, you know, I'm thinking of a young man I had been working with recently who was that same thing that sort of the idea of emotional prosperity gospel, as Curtis previously covered, right? That was the big thing. And the fact that he was struggling with these suicidal thoughts definitely meant that he was of little faith. And I was just able to sort of ask him, well, what do you do about the fact that that's not a universally held belief, right? And even that was mind blowing to the student, right? Because there is a certain belief when we have that strong implicit emotional reaction belief that maybe everybody believes in it the same way. But introducing to the fact that that's not the case really opened up a world where we could start to explore that a lot more. And so those are all ways, at least to start off with, that we might address the theology of suicide in the room. But I think another population where we need to address the theology of suicide in clinical work is actually survivors of suicide loss. And so there's actually a recent review came out looking into some of the religious experiences of our survivors of suicide loss within their recovery process, right? And those folks may even come seeking our services much more frequently, right? Because they're not necessarily struggling with a personal stigma about suicide that would be leading them away from mental health service seeking, right? Because it's unfortunate that their loved one or relation passed away through suicide. And so um, I find that we get a large number of folks experiencing suicide loss as a presenting concern. Not a large number is maybe too strong of a statement, but there's certainly a significant number of them. And so um, the research has shown in the recent review, as I mentioned, that if stigmas exist regarding suicide, they can impede social and religious support seeking, right? And that's such a huge critical thing for anyone recovering through a grief process, right? Is that they activate their social support networks, and especially for our strongly religious folks, that's going to be their church communities, right? That's one of the great strengths that being involved in, the body of Christ provides us, right? Is that we're connected to the other body of believers, and that we can, lean on each other in hard times, as well as our relationship with God to lean on. But if those people are coming out of a place in particular where there is a strong stigma towards suicide, it may be really important to help them identify sources of religious support that may not be stigmatized, right? Maybe that's certain pastoral figures with more religious training and more nuanced beliefs around it, or maybe that's other certain supportive friends within a church community rather than other friends within the church community. As we know, there's a variance of theological beliefs even within a congregation. And so I find that has been an extremely helpful tool to not to break down the problems in social support seeking. And then the other thing that I think just becomes more important, while it is super important anytime we're talking about grief, but the um, the exploration of meaning making becomes so much more important than maybe in uncomplicated bereavement, right? Um, and that is because we see both unconscious spiritual religious experiences, such as beliefs as though we're seeing the lost loved one, or feeling as though they've maybe passed on to a better place or whatever, experiencing them in some form. These experiences can be jarring, especially if experienced in the context of beliefs about damnation to hell or beliefs about mortal sin. But also, there is a high likelihood that people will be experiencing conscious religious and spiritual exploration in light of a loss like that. It's a time that you start rewriting your meaning systems around life and death. And so these both come together and make it so that we need to really, really be focused on the meaning making capacities that our clients are going through. But let me pass it back to Curtis just to talk a little bit more about the gatekeeper training, and even if you're interested in implementing it, and then go ahead and get us out of here. So Curtis, I throw it to you.
All right. Well, I wanted to conclude this seminar with just a few notes about implementing this, but let me just kind of review. So we shared how we're saying that to address suicide on campus, it's important to address stigma. And we talked through 4 different types of suicide stigma that are, engendered by religious beliefs, Christian beliefs. Alyssa kind of pointed out that we've got some research suggesting that this is effective, that this is producing changes in stigma, decreasing stigma, and maybe even increasing some positive outcomes. And then Nathaniel gave some tips in terms of how to use this clinically. But let me kind of bring it back full circle and talk about, well, how do we actually put this into practice on a Christian college campus? And so what I assume many of you are familiar with is learning management systems. Now, I know that there's other ones, but Canvas is one of the major ones. And so I wanted to just talk briefly about how do you do this? And I would say that there's actually 3 main options if you're looking to implement this online on a learning management system. And so the first one is actually not even to use a learning management system, and that would be to send the link directly to students and others who would benefit from the training. For the sake of wanting to know who's using this, I'm not going to give you the link. I will give you my email address in the next slide, and I'll give you a chance to email me. But I do want this implemented. I do want this to be distributed, because that's the whole goal. That's what we would love to see is, if you think this is going to be helpful, if you work at a Christian college campus, we would love to see it be used. So that's one option. The second option is to embed the training on a website. Now, if you are interested in that, in your email, just let me know. That is an option. But I do want you to know that it requires either WordPress, Drupal, or Moodle as the sort of the format of the website. But the third one that I encourage you to consider would be to create a self-study course. So the advantage of this is that you can actually include an evaluation survey. You can include like questions about whether they enjoyed it, but also questions about what they learned from it. And there can be a certificate of completion. And the certificate could actually be used as a requirement for various on-campus positions like RAs or different internships, things like that. And so that could be one way to implement this. I could say more, but I don't want to get into too many details on this. So if you're curious about this, just email me and I'd be happy to provide you with more resources. So as promised, if you are interested in using this intervention at your university, just go ahead and reach out to me, Curtis Lehmann. I provide my email, drkurtlehmann@gmail.com. You could also email me at my APU address, clehmann, Lehmann, @apu.edu. And we are making this intervention available for free. However, if you want this customized, we know that the theology of it you might have some concerns or want it to look a little bit differently. That is an option, but we would be charging some fees to do that customization work. Or if you want it branded, or if you want local hosting, or if you want any sort of customer support, we could do that, but a fee would be charged, would be associated with it. So again, we're not looking to make a profit, but we want to make sure that this is something that we can maintain for the long run. Now, that was it. So we do appreciate you attending. I'm going to show you the references. So if you want to look at these more closely, you can go ahead and pause. I'm not going to show them for very long. And this is the second page of references. There's a few other references that we didn't get on here. So if you want any of those, just email me. And lastly, just want to say thank you for attending. I hope it was helpful. All right. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Take care.